Recent headlines are filled with crises and blame. Based on pundits' prognostications, many Americans are worried inflation is here. New reports and podcasts have guests suggesting we may experience rising inflation in the coming months, perhaps years. Some say it's a sign of economic bungling by the Biden administration. Others that it's because of former President Trump's policies. At the same time, we're facing globally persistent shortages of myriad items, from paper to computer chips. Costco is set to once again implement a limit to the amount of toilet paper you can purchase in one visit. Questions expressed by many, perhaps even you, are: why are these two issues happening? Is there a connection between them? And who's to blame? A person with high systemic intelligence, known as SysQ, is in a better position to answer these questions and more. In this short video, which summarizes the analysis in the column, we'll use SysQ to build a more useful mental model of supply chain dynamics and the links to inflation. All mental models are simplifications of reality. The following is a very high-level and incomplete mental model, but a SysQ mental model is more consistent with how the world works with reality, and thus it's more useful for making sense of the world. And this mental model will be generic enough that you may see how it applies to your organization. We'll start building this mental model with the two variables we absolutely must have to understand shortages and inflation: goods available, or inventory, and prices. We'll make goods inventory as stock. Stocks are like bathtubs. They accumulate stuff. In this case, they accumulate goods. At any point in time, you can measure the height of a bathtub. The stock of goods is filled each week by the amount that's produced that week. This weekly producing is a flow. Flows require time to exist. If you need to specify a time unit when describing a variable, it's almost always a flow. So in this case, we have goods produced per week. The outflow is selling. This is the weekly rate, goods sold per week. Upstream, before you have goods in inventory, you have a stock of raw materials. These raw materials must be integrated, assembled, put together through the production process into finished goods. The half shading of the icon indicates there's a conversion of units. Raw materials units are converted into goods units through the production process. Raw materials might be basic goods like pulp for paper. They may be more sophisticated like wiring and circuit boards that are assembled into chips. The stock of production capital is the resource required to produce. It might be factories, equipment, production staff. It's anything you need to produce something. Utilization determines the productivity of that resource. How hard do you work that resource? What are the units of goods produced per resource per week? So goods produced per week is calculated by production capital times goods produced per unit of capital per week. Demand determines the rate of weekly sales or selling. The amount of inventory remaining divided by demand calculates supply relative to demand. And we know that supply relative to demand sets the price. The O next to the arrowhead indicates that as supply relative to demand moves in one direction, price moves in the opposite direction, thus the O. The dashed lines indicate a time delay. Often it takes the market time to adjust price when supply relative to demand changes. Lots of something with lower demand means prices are slashed. A dearth of something and high demand, well, it causes an increase in price. As price moves in a direction, utilization tends to move in the same direction. High prices stimulate more production, or higher utilization. Workers put in more hours, machines are worked for more hours per week. This creates a balancing loop, B1. Balancing loops are basic system structures that try to keep a variable in balance. If goods inventory increases, activities through the balancing loop try to bring inventory back down to some target level. Balancing loops play a key role in trying to keep prices and inventories in line with demand. A second balancing loop stimulates changes in raw materials orders. One constraint to producing and building goods inventory back up are the amount of raw materials producers have to produce with. This balancing loop causes changes in raw materials orders. The conveyor represents a time delay for stuff. When the flow of ordering occurs, the raw materials step onto the conveyor and eventually are received and enter inventory. Think of this as orders of some materials like chips being placed with their distributor in China. Those chips are loaded on a ship and take a few weeks to make it to the United States. Or perhaps a plane, but still, there's a time delay between ordering and receiving. The longest time delay to adjust producing and goods inventory impacts production capital. Through careful deliberation, producers may choose to invest in new capital. It takes a long time to develop new capital, like equipment, especially factories, thus the longer conveyor. Investment requires forecasting long-term profitability, because you only invest in something with a long lifespan, like equipment, like factories, if you know it's worth it for the next several years. One activity often overlooked is capital turnover. Capital doesn't last forever. Equipment built now will likely be retired or replaced several years from now. Note, there's often another loop from retirement. When retired, the decision is usually whether or not to replace it. What insight does this map provide into the recent dynamics of shortages and inflation? Let's look at several of the variables over time. In the upper right, we can note that the pandemic of 2020 causes demand to fall sharply and stay lower for a sustained length of time. The red graph shows goods inventory would increase because of less sales. Below that, supply relative to demand rose commensurately, while this surplus of goods causes price, shown in the graph next to price, to fall. What does this do to producer decision rules upstream? In the very short term, utilization slows, shown in balancing loop B1. It's easy to shorten work schedules, lay off workers, let factories have more idle time. At the same time, as shown in balancing loop 2, raw material orders would decrease. No need for raw material inventory to overflow warehouse capacity. One manufacturer I consult for dropped raw material ordering by nearly a third. Finally, as the lower demand persists, capital retires and is not replaced, shown in balancing loop 3. All of this reduces the overall system's ability to instantaneously increase production. What happens if demand increases substantially? Supply relative to demand decreases, and prices start to rise. Producers will quickly ramp up production, which lowers raw materials inventories. This increases orders for raw material, which will eventually get there. But if materials need to be produced, they'll be delayed for the same structural reasons as shown here. Finally, producers will invest in new capital, but that will take a long time to become active. If demand continues to grow, the balancing loops will take a long time to catch up. Prices will keep rising, resulting in inflation. The lag shown here will play a significant role in continuing supply shortages relative to demand. Inflation will continue for some time, and the problem is one that is structural and can't be attributed to one person or administration, unless you assume the previous administration could have done something to avoid the sharp drop in demand in the first place. This analysis highlights several useful systemic intelligence principles. First, the process of building a map clarifies thinking by forcing causal thinking, what systems thinkers refer to as operational thinking. The stock and flow language best facilitates operational thinking because it forces the distinction between the resources in the system and the performance those resources generate. Stock and flow maps are often superior because they force us to focus on the physics, how something works. They help us easily portray time delays, while also linking feedback loops from conditions in the system to actions to change those conditions. And they allow us to see how the shifting dominance between feedback loops generate behavior, often trying, but failing, to keep the system in equilibrium. Hopefully, this analysis helped to clarify why we may experience continuing inflation and supply shortages. And more importantly, perhaps gave you insight on how to apply SysQ to your organization, especially if involved in any supply chain type process.